Hi there, Sandra here from Create in Spain, and today I wanted to give you a little information about paper types that you may not be aware, and indeed of pen types or colouring types that you might not understand. So this is a piece of my usual cheapy cardstock that I buy in Spain. It comes in an A3 pad of, I think it's something like 20 sheets, and it cost me all of €2. However, it's a nice smooth cardstock, it cuts really well, and it's very handy for my cutting machine. If I want to colour an image though, what can it coat with? And the answer is not an awful lot. It will coat with alcohol markers without any difficulty. That's fine. But if I'm to use watercolour or ink tints, brushes and brush pens and things like that, watercolour brush pens, it's useless. They don't blend really well, they pill the paper in places, and yeah, felt tips and things like that. Normal stuff, no. Alcohol markers, yes. Everything else, forget it. So what do you have to use to get good results on more than one medium? Is there something that you can buy that you can put ink tints, pencils, watercolour brush pens, alcohol markers, normal felt tips? Is there something like that? The answer is yes, there is. Enter this. Now this happens to be a Fabriano brand, which is Italian, but it is a Bristol cardstock. This just happened to be the one that I could easily order at a reasonable price. Well, when I say reasonable, it's much dearer than my normal cardstock, but for artist range papers, it's reasonable. This cost me €8.90 on Amazon for 20 sheets of A4. Not the sort of stuff that I would use for my card bases, but I would be quite happy to use that for my card fronts if I'm illustrating anything. And this is a piece of it. It's very smooth, very nice. It is 250 GM or £145 if that's the measurement you are used to. It is not quite the same bright white as my cheapy one, slightly creamy, but it's not overly creamy to look at. So there are occasions when you might want to use more than one medium on your project. So I was doing a little bit of testing out. So I tried it with alcohol markers, thumbs up, works fine. I tried it with pencils, coloured pencils. Now I've got two different colour pencil types on here. My watercolour pencils and indeed my ink tints. My ink tints are the stronger colours. It works fine. You still have to work at getting rid of the lines a little bit, more than you would with, say, a water brush pen, but it definitely works. And although it does warp slightly with water, it's actually not too bad. In all instances where I was blending with water, I used this cheapy water brush pen. Yeah, on all occasions I use that. This is a sample with watercolour brush pens, the Chromatex that I recently got, and these blend really, really nicely on it. There might possibly be a little bit of bleeding, but not enough to really notice. However, one thing that I hadn't tried, which you may be interested in, and came up with this sample, was your average normal cheapy washable children's felt tips. I've got two different varieties here. These are double-ended chubby tips, like so, and this one is a double-ended, so it's fine tipped on one side shall be on the other, but just one colour in the entire barrel. And I've got a few of these hanging around that I use from time to time for various things. And I used it on this cardstock and it works beautifully. It blends really, really easily, no trouble whatsoever, which it doesn't do on my cheapy cardstock. This is what happens if I use it on my cheapy cardstock. It pills and it's useless. It does not blend. On this, no problem blending whatsoever. You may be thinking, oh no, I've gone and bought water brush pens for no reason at all. Well, actually no, the main reason for buying a water brush pen is because it's a brush. If you're used to watercolouring in the traditional sense, then you'll find using a brush a lot easier. If, however, you haven't bought yourself water brush pens yet and you are not familiar with watercolouring as an art form with a brush, and you've got some of these, if you've got the appropriate paper, you can use them. If you haven't ever bothered to buy a decent cardstock and you've been trying to use these and it hasn't worked, as I showed in a recent video, it is the paper which is the problem and not the pens. Okay? These are water soluble in the same way that the watercolour brush pens are. They just don't have the same type of nib. Now if you want a brush nib, then fine, watercolour brush pens are the way to go, but do check that you're buying ones that actually have a proper brush tip and not just something which is called a brush tip. I mean, these markers, these alcohol markers are called brush tip, but that's not a brush, that's a bullet nib. That's the same sort of things I would get on there. Okay, so you want to make sure that if you're going to get watercolour brush pens, then if you're going to pay out that kind of money for them, at least get the proper brush tip. Chromatech do have a proper brush tip. It is the same type of bristles as you have on here. So they're nylon bristles and it's a proper brush. So if you've got this type of cheap children's felt tip which is designed to be washed out of the laundry, then you can use it on this without any difficulty whatsoever. It works perfectly well, get excellent results, and yeah, the job is done. I also did a sample here where I used the felt tips and I made them very, very wet. So it's this two colour felt tips put together with various amounts of water, and in fact I used the darker end on it and the pink, and with the various amounts of water you will get different results. So even really flooding it with water, and I did flood it with water, it's not pilling. Okay, so that is the difference between your cheapy cardstock and your proper quality cardstock. And this is Bristol cardstock, which is a type of cardstock, and it is sold in many different places by many different manufacturers. But please, if you're going to buy it, check what it says on the pack before you buy. Check that it says that it's suitable for what you're trying to use on it. And that way you won't spend a lot of money for no result. But I think that €8.90 for 20 sheets, when I can use various different mediums on this, is actually worthwhile. It's not something I'm going to use, as I said, for my card bases, but for some of the artwork that I do on them, it's quite a possibility. And at least now I do have something that I can use. My pencils, my pens, my brush pens, my alcohol markers on the same piece of paper. Okay, before I go, I forgot something. I wanted to explain to you why, although you can use your alcohol markers on watercolour paper, you probably shouldn't. Two reasons. Watercolour paper, most of it is textured, so that's going to have more of an effect on your nibs, wear them out quicker than a smooth cardstock. But the other reason is that although they will blend quite happily on watercolour paper is designed to soak up water. It is like a sponge. You will be taking more of the colour out of your pens than you would by using it on a smooth cardstock. It will literally suck the ink out of these, and you will find yourself with pens that are drying out quicker than they would normally. So although very occasionally I will use them on watercolour, it's not something I would do habitually. Thanks for watching. Take care now. Bye.